October 1973. You wake up and drive to the gas station. There's a line stretching 4 blocks. You wait 2 hours. When you finally reach the pump, the attendant tells you 10 gallons maximum. Come back tomorrow. Your heating bill has doubled. The grocery store has raised prices 3 times in 6 weeks. Your retirement account has lost a third of its value. And it's still falling. You didn't start a war. You didn't make any bad financial decisions. You did everything right. But somewhere between your paycheck and your savings account, something is quietly stealing from you. And it has a name. In 90 days, between October 1973 and January 1974, the American stock market lost 45% of its value. 500,000 jobs disappeared. Inflation hit 12%. An entire generation watched their savings evaporate in real time. While that was happening, 7 oil companies quietly posted profit increases of up to 85% in a single year. That is not a coincidence. That is a system working exactly as designed. And right now, in 2026, oil prices are surging again. The same institutions are positioned. The same playbook is open. The only question is whether you understand what's coming before it arrives at your door. This is the story they never finished telling you. Stay with this until the end, because the 2026 parallel is something nobody has connected publicly yet. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. To understand what happened in 1973, you first need to understand just how confident America was that nothing like this could ever happen. The early 1970s felt like the permanent peak of Western prosperity. America had just won the space race. The post-war economic boom that had lifted an entire generation was still running hot. Unemployment was low, highways were full, suburban homes were being built by the millions. The automobile wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of freedom, a statement that energy was cheap, abundant, and infinite. Time magazine declared January 1973 a gilt-edged year. The Dow Jones was hovering near record highs. White House economists were predicting continued growth. But beneath that confidence, the foundation was already cracking. 2 years earlier, in August 1971, President Nixon had made one of the most consequential financial decisions in modern history. He closed the gold window. He ended the convertibility of the US dollar into gold at $35 per ounce, unilaterally dismantling the Bretton Woods system that had governed global finance since 1944. The logic was cold and pragmatic. The Vietnam War had been enormously expensive. America had been printing money to pay for it. Foreign central banks, especially in Europe and Japan, had started quietly converting their dollar reserves into gold, draining American reserves at an alarming pace. Nixon had to stop the bleeding. But here's the question nobody was asking publicly. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, what was backing it? There was no clean answer. The dollar floated. It devalued. And the world's financial system began operating on something closer to faith than physics. Oil-producing nations noticed immediately. Because oil was priced in dollars. A weaker dollar meant their oil was effectively cheaper in real terms. Same cost to pump it out of the ground, less money in return. That frustration, quiet, building, ignored by Washington, was about to become a weapon. Here's where it gets interesting. Because the crisis that was about to hit America wasn't just an accident of war. It was the predictable consequence of decisions made years earlier, by people who understood exactly what they were doing. Keep watching. October 6, 1973. The holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Israeli soldiers were fasting and praying. Command structures were minimally staffed. Intelligence agencies were quiet. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Syrian President Hafez al-Assad had chosen this moment with surgical precision. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal in the south with overwhelming numbers, catching Israeli defenses completely flat-footed. Syrian tanks poured into the Golan Heights simultaneously. In the opening hours, it genuinely looked like Israel might be overrun. Washington's response was immediate and consequential. Nixon authorized Operation Nickel Grass, a massive American military airlift delivering over 22,000 tons of equipment directly to Israel. Tanks, artillery, ammunition, aircraft. The resupply turned the tide within days. But this decision, made in a White House simultaneously consumed by Watergate, triggered exactly the response that American diplomats had spent years quietly warning about. On October 17, 1973, Arab members of OPEC announced a 5% monthly cut in oil production. 2 days later, on October 19th, the day after Nixon formally asked Congress for $2.2 billion in emergency military aid to Israel, Saudi King Faisal made the call that would reshape the global economy for the next 50 years. Total oil embargo, not a reduction, a complete cutoff against the United States, the Netherlands, Portugal, South Africa, Rhodesia. No Arab oil. Full stop. Now, before you assume this was simply a matter of turning off a tap, you need to understand what the American economy actually ran on in 1973. The United States was consuming roughly 1/3 of all oil produced in the world, with just 6% of the global population. American domestic production had peaked in 1970 and was declining. Imports had been rising to fill the gap. The country's suburbs, highways, manufacturing base, and heating systems had all been built on one assumption: cheap, abundant, petroleum. The economy wasn't addicted to oil. It was built from oil, bone deep. And here is where the story stops being about geopolitics and starts being about your money. Because what happened next wasn't just an energy crisis. It was the largest transfer of wealth from ordinary people to financial institutions in peacetime American history. And the mechanism they used is still running today. Within weeks of the embargo announcement, crude oil began its ascent, from $2.90 per barrel to $11.65 per barrel by January 1974, a 400% increase in less than 3 months. Let that number settle for a moment. The single most important industrial input in the American economy quadrupled in price in 90 days. The street-level effects were something no American alive in that period ever forgot. Gas lines, miles of them. Cars stretching around city blocks, around shopping centers, around entire neighborhoods. People arriving before dawn just to secure a place in line. Stations began limiting customers to 10 gallons per visit. States introduced odd-even rationing. If your license plate ended in an odd number, you could only buy gas on odd-numbered days. Some stations simply posted signs that said no gas. The national speed limit was dropped to 55 miles per hour to conserve fuel. Daylight saving time was extended year-round. Federal building thermostats were ordered to 68 degrees. The lights in Times Square, arguably the most electric symbol of American prosperity in the world, were partially turned off. America was rationing gasoline like a wartime economy. But the gas lines were only the visible surface of something far more destructive happening beneath. Because oil wasn't just in your car, it was in everything. Every manufactured good, every chemical, every plastic, every item on a supermarket shelf that had been transported, processed, packaged, or refrigerated. Every factory floor, every airplane ticket, every heating bill. When the price of oil quadrupled, the cost of everything that depended on oil inflated in its wake. In an economy as oil-saturated as America's, that meant nearly everything. Consumer price inflation jumped from 3.4% in 1972 to 12.3% in 1974. Unemployment climbed from 4.9% to a peak of 8.9% in 1975, the highest since the Great Depression. The stock market lost 45% of its value across 694 days, the worst decline since 1929, and if you adjust those losses for inflation, the real purchasing power loss was closer to 80%. Avon products fell from $140 per share to $18.50. Coca-Cola dropped from $150 to $44. IBM, Kodak, McDonald's, all fell 50 to 60% from their 1973 highs. 313 growth mutual funds lost money in 1974. Not most of them, almost all of them. There was nowhere to hide. Bonds crushed by rising interest rates. Growth stocks demolished by falling earnings. Cash eaten alive by inflation. This is what economists eventually named stagflation. A combination of stagnation and inflation. And it was in practice one of the cruelest economic conditions a working person could face. Your savings were being eaten alive by rising prices. At exactly the moment the job market was drying up, you couldn't spend your way out because spending pushed prices higher. You couldn't save your way out because savings were losing real value by the week. Before we go further, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. Do you think what happened in 1973 was an accident of war, or was it a planned transfer of wealth? Hold that thought, because what I'm about to show you will change your answer. While ordinary Americans were waiting in gas lines and watching their retirement accounts collapse, a very specific group of people were having one of the best financial years of their lives. The 7 largest oil companies in the world, Exxon, Texaco, Mobil, Gulf, Chevron, British Petroleum, and Royal Dutch Shell, reported profit increases of between 40 and 85% in a single year. Exxon alone became the richest corporation in the United States, posting revenues of $45.1 billion within 2 years. They had not discovered new oil. They had not made any technological breakthrough. They had not done anything strategically brilliant. They had simply been sitting on the right asset when the price of that asset quadrupled. The same government telling ordinary citizens to turn down their thermostats and drive 55 miles per hour was simultaneously presiding over the largest single transfer of wealth from consumers to energy producers in American peacetime history. But here's the layer that almost never gets mentioned. And this is where the story stops being about oil companies and starts being about the architecture of the entire modern financial system. What I'm about to show you is the part of the 1973 story that took over 40 years to become public. It was hidden in classified diplomatic documents. It only surfaced in 2016, when a journalist filed a Freedom of Information Act request to the National Archives. And it explains everything about why the world works the way it does today. The embargo was officially lifted on March 18, 1974. But the price of oil did not go back down. It stayed elevated, permanently. And in the months that followed, in meetings that were deliberately kept off the public record, Henry Kissinger and American Treasury officials brokered an arrangement with Saudi Arabia that would become the foundational plumbing of the modern financial world. The arrangement was this: Saudi Arabia, and eventually all OPEC members, would price their oil exclusively in US dollars. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection to Saudi Arabia and its energy infrastructure. And the enormous surpluses of dollars that Saudi Arabia accumulated from oil sales would be recycled back into US Treasury bonds, financing American government debt. Every country that needed oil had to first acquire dollars. Global demand for the dollar was effectively guaranteed by the energy needs of the entire industrialized world. This is the petrodollar system, and it is arguably the most important financial architecture that almost no ordinary person has ever heard of. It is what allowed the United States to run persistent trade deficits without the currency collapses that would normally follow. It is what made US Treasury bonds the world's default safe haven asset. It is the structural mechanism that transformed the economic catastrophe of 1973 into a long-term American strategic advantage. The crisis didn't just create misery, it created a new financial order. And embedded in that order were winners and losers who never had a democratic vote on the arrangement. The classified version of this deal, a confidential diplomatic agreement on Saudi investment in US Treasuries, wasn't made public until 2016. When Bloomberg News obtained the relevant documents through a Freedom of Information Act request. 42 years of silence. Now here's where this stops being history and becomes a live news story. Because everything I just described, the oil shock, the wealth transfer, the secret currency deal, is being reconstructed right now. With updated players, updated weapons, and updated stakes. And this time, the system that protected America in 1973 may not hold. Right now, in 2026, oil prices are surging. The reasons being given publicly are familiar: Middle East tensions, supply disruptions, geopolitical uncertainty. But underneath those explanations, the same structural forces that drove 1973 are reassembling. Here's what's different this time, and why it's more dangerous. In 1973, America imported roughly 30% of its oil. Today, the United States is a net energy exporter. American shale production has fundamentally changed direct exposure to Middle East supply. So you might think we're protected this time. We're not. Because the global economy is incomparably more integrated now than it was in 1973. Supply chain interdependencies that modern manufacturing, logistics, and agriculture built over 50 years of globalization mean that an oil shock doesn't need to hit American gas pumps directly to devastate American consumers. If Asian refineries slow down, global electronic supply chains are disrupted. If fertilizer shipments are affected, food prices spike at the start of planting season. If shipping insurance costs surge, every imported good becomes more expensive. The inflation that reaches your grocery store in 2026 doesn't need a direct line from the Middle East to get there. But here's the deeper parallel that nobody is connecting publicly. In 1973, the petrodollar deal saved America's financial dominance. That deal is now under visible stress for the first time in 50 years. Saudi Arabia has been diversifying away from dollar dependency. China has been buying Gulf oil in yuan. BRICS nations are actively constructing alternative settlement systems that bypass the dollar entirely. The Strait of Hormuz, through which flows 20% of global petroleum consumption, is being selectively closed, not to everyone, to Western nations specifically. Chinese and Russian flag vessels are being permitted to pass. Read that again. The strait is not closed. It is being used as a geopolitical filter. That is not an energy crisis. That is a financial power transition happening in real time through an oil choke point. The same playbook that created the petrodollar in 1974 is being used to dismantle it in 2026. And the same question that applied in 1973 applies today. Who is positioned to profit while ordinary people absorb the cost? Energy stocks are surging while consumer confidence falls. Defense contractors are reporting record order books. Commodity trading firms that positioned earlier posting extraordinary returns. The distribution of pain and profit is following the 1973 script with uncomfortable precision. And this brings us to the most important part of this entire story. Not the history, not even the 2026 parallel, but the pattern underneath both of them. The one that tells you what comes next and what you can actually do about it. The 1973 oil embargo ended. The gas lines went away. The stock market recovered, eventually. But the adaptation took a decade, and it cost a generation. The S&P 500 adjusted for inflation didn't recover its real 1973 value until the early 1980s. An entire cohort of workers entered their prime earning years in the shadow of stagflation and emerged the other side with permanently diminished savings and permanently elevated cynicism about the institutions that were supposed to protect them. Here is what history actually teaches, if you're willing to read it honestly. Economic catastrophe and economic opportunity are not opposites. They are very often two faces of the same event. Which one you experience depends almost entirely on where you sit in the system when the disruption arrives. John D. Rockefeller understood that the person who controls refining controls the industry. The Rothschilds understood that the person who controls the flow of money controls the outcome of wars. Both understood something that 1973 makes uncomfortably clear. The people who design the system and the people who bear its costs are rarely the same people. That was true in 1973. The decisions that led to the crisis were made in rooms most Americans never knew existed. The profits from the crisis flowed to institutions most Americans never directly interacted with. And the costs, the gas lines, the lost jobs, the evaporated savings landed on people who had no voice in any of it. The question worth asking, right now, is not whether history is repeating. It clearly is. The question is where you sit in the system when this iteration completes. Understanding the mechanism is the first step, and you just took it. If this connected dots you hadn't seen connected before, that's exactly what this channel exists to do. The forensic financial history that doesn't make it into textbooks. The patterns that only become visible when you zoom out far enough. Drop a comment below. Do you think the petrodollar system survives the next decade? I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, the next video goes even deeper. You won't want to miss it.